Well, welcome everybody to a special University of Texas event brought to you jointly by the Strauss Center for International Security and Law and the Clements Center for National Security. I'm Bobby Chesney. I'm the director of the Strauss Center, and on behalf of my colleague, Dr. Will Inboden, executive director of the Clements Center, I want to welcome you all here today for a unfortunately, very timely and definitely very interesting event. It's a sequel to an event we actually held seemingly years ago, but really only 6 months or so ago, just before the pandemic lockdown phase really began. We were fortunate enough to have Dr. Julie Schafer here in person talking with our own Dr. Michele Malvesti, going over the particulars of the government's traditional mode of response to pandemics, how things were unfolding to that stage in this current instance. And now we're back for a sequel event to look in on how things have been going and where they might still go. I'm going to quickly give an introduction to Dr. Schafer, and then I'm going to introduce our moderator for today, Dr. Malvesti, and then we'll get underway and we'll turn it over to them. Dr. Schafer is the Chief Technology Officer for Flu Lab. Flu Lab is a place where they stretch the boundaries of how technology can be used to understand how to respond to and defeat influenza, and more recently, COVID-19, of course. Before she moved to philanthropy, Julie spent 15 years in the US government. Most recently, she was Director of Strategy at BARDA. That's the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. At BARDA, BARDA is charged with developing vaccines, treatments, diagnostics for intentional and naturally emerging threats, including pandemic influenza and emerging infectious diseases. Julie has served as the Director for Medical and Biodefense Preparedness Policy at the National Security Council, the White House. When she was at the Department of Health and Human Services, Julie co-developed numerous strategies and plans, including the Health and Human Services Pandemic Influenza Plan, elements of the 2009 H1N1 pandemic response. She co-founded a new division in BARDA devoted to accelerating transformative solutions to dire health security threats. Julie, welcome back to Austin, if only virtually. Now, before we hear from Julie, of course, we're going to hear from our moderator, our own Dr. Michele Malvesti, who we're always glad to welcome back. Dr. Malvesti currently serves as Senior National Security Fellow with both the Strauss Center and the Clements Center. It's a joint appointment. And she's a visiting professor who will be teaching this spring at the LBJ School. So when those courses come out, sign up. Her courses rotate across a number of topics, including courses on national security decision-making and on the politics and role of gender in global affairs. During her time in government, Michele served more than 5 years on the National Security Council staff during the George W. Bush administration, including serving as Senior Director for Combating Terrorism Strategy. Michele, Julie, I'm so pleased you're able to be here and give us time out of your busy schedules to do this for us and for our community. And I'm going to turn it over to you now, Michele. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Professor Chesney, Bobby. Appreciate the kind words. And of course, it's a pleasure to share the screen with Dr. Schafer again. You know, during our first conversation back in February, we were in a very different place with regard to the virus known as SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19, the disease. And at the time when we spoke, when we gathered back in February, the World Health Organization had not yet declared it to be a pandemic. As a matter of fact, it had assessed it and viewed it as a series of epidemics globally, you know, worldwide. But now, today, we are all in a very different place. Worldwide, right now, we have more than 34 million confirmed cases, more than 1 million confirmed fatalities across the globe, and closing in on 207 deaths, again, known fatalities related to COVID-19 in the United States alone. It's important also, though, to note that we have, you know, more than 23.6 million individuals across the globe who have also recovered from this virus. The interesting thing is that our understanding of this virus has expanded so greatly over the past 7 months. We're actually seeing science, we're actually seeing our understanding evolve and unfold in real time. So Dr. Schafer, Julie, thank you so much for joining us. So that we can continue our own conversation, our own understanding of this virus and the events. And so for our audience today, I'd like to let you know that we're going to cover three broad categories of information. We're going to explore, in the first instance, the events that our planning anticipated and those that our planning failed to anticipate. We're also going to evaluate where we have been successful in our response, as well as where we have fallen short. And then finally, look at pathways forward to a post-COVID normal. So let's begin. Back in February, Julie, we spoke briefly about the H1N1 pandemic from 2009, a pandemic that, quite frankly, most of us in the audience that day did not remember. And you noted that the 2009 pandemic was not the pandemic we had planned for. So I turn to you today. Is today's pandemic the pandemic we planned for? If you're looking at the current crisis, what events did our planning appropriately consider, account for, and anticipate? Over to you.
Oh, great. Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be back with you. In many ways, this pandemic is the one that we planned against, is the one that we were so concerned about, that as really globally, starting around 2005, we started doing very serious pandemic planning, saying, hey, guess what? An infectious disease could completely take over the world in terms of the effect on people and the effect on society and the economic effects. And so in that way, yes, we're there. The way that it doesn't really match our planning is that we anticipated it being an influenza pandemic, not necessarily a coronavirus pandemic. And so while there are many areas that around planning, for example, around what are termed those community mitigation strategies, which include social distancing and can include wearing masks and all of these things that are very commonplace to our existence right now. That was very much something that was planned. The wait to starting a vaccine from scratch is an example of something that wasn't planned because our planning was around an influenza virus, in which we already have a number of licensed influenza vaccines. So the wait for a vaccine would be shorter and the degree of certainty would be greater that we would be able to have a vaccine.
Okay, could you spend a little more time on the vaccine component? Looking at it, you mentioned that our planning did not particularly account for starting from scratch, and our understanding of how long a vaccine typically takes to come to fruition, the acceleration of that, the public-private partnerships, the strong collaboration. Could you walk us through where we are in the vaccine process and what you might anticipate on that going forward?
Sure. So I guess I'm selling us a little short to say that we are starting totally from scratch. Is that we had some understanding about viruses like this from our experience from SARS and which in the early 2000s, 2003, ending in 2004, and MERS, which is another closely related virus. In both cases, we had started vaccine and therapeutics development programs. Something that I know that we touched on last time, and you really just can't emphasize it enough in terms of the boom and bust of how we globally respond to infectious diseases, where a lot of resources will be put toward an emerging infectious disease, and then it peters off when something else happens. So either the virus disappears, kind of like SARS did, or we're able to suppress it. It may not disappear like Ebola, but maybe it's controlled, and then five other things happen, and resources and energies go in another direction. So that's to say that we were early, so that vaccine development for those closely related viruses wasn't as far as long as it would have been nice if they were a little further along, because it would make it faster. So I know a lot of folks have seen that it usually takes around 15 years to develop a vaccine. It's a very long and laborious process, and a bit of a roller coaster ride if you're on it. There are some things that are helping us move a little faster than we would have ordinarily. Some of it are scientific, the understandings about the importance of the spike protein, for example, that is an important basis for these vaccines. We know that from our past experiences from related viruses. We have some vaccine platforms that are able to be, that we think are faster than our traditional platforms. And these are nucleic acid-based platforms that we have great. So like Moderna or something. So those have advanced, those technologically have advanced so that we can bring them to bear for this. The other thing, and this is the less magical advances in technology and more about the economics part, is that stages that we would normally do sequentially, we're doing in parallel. Now, the reason that we don't normally do those kind of stages in parallel is because of the financial risk. So as we get later in development of vaccine, later in development, so a vaccine is gone through those early tests, and now it's being tested in humans, and they're figuring out how to scale up manufacturing to be able to make a whole lot. Those are very costly processes. And if something happens in one of those processes that sets you back, the reason to do it sequentially is so you don't lose an enormous amount of money. You only lose a certain amount of money. So in an emergency, we're less concerned about losing that money because the time that we gain is more important. So that is a very important factor on why we have 11, globally, there are 11 different vaccines in phase 3 studies. Those are the critical phase, kind of the make it or break it phase of vaccine or of medical countermeasure development in so quickly, where normally it would take years to have that many.
And Julie, educate us. Phase 3, that is the last phase prior to when, for example, in the United States, an FDA might approve a vaccine or consider it to be safe and effective and approve it for wide scale distribution. Is that correct?
That's correct. So the phases in which they always start at phase 1 is when those phases start with once humans are involved. So phase 1, we're looking for safety. Phase 2, we're learning. Of course, we're always gaining information about safety. But phase 2, we're looking at safety, but then we're also looking at getting the dose just right and getting some early signals on how well the vaccine will work. Phase 3 is having the vaccine in a lot of people, gathering a lot more data on how the vaccine performs, and to get a sense for how efficacious the vaccine will be, and then to gather even more data about how the vaccine is in people, because humans, there's a lot of variety in humans, as we all know, and so it's important to test medical countermeasures, to gather experience of a lot of different people. So it's important to have so that's another reason it's really important to have clinical trials represent what a population looks like so that we can gather that experience.
Julie, or Dr. Schafer, what assumptions did we make early on, either in the planning or quite frankly, early on in this crisis, that perhaps no longer hold today based on what we know now?
Sure, and I think you mentioned it at the beginning, and honestly, we could say it every sentence, and it isn't saying it enough. Is that what's really challenging and uncomfortable and really true is that we are living science in real time. So that means that our assumptions are continually needing to be updated, and our policies and guidance need to be continually updated as we learn more. And that's confusing and challenging, and also really important. So a great example of that, well, I guess it's not a great example, an example of something that's really confusing and is still unfolding is the importance and use of antibody tests. So, or serological testing. So the idea, what is a test like that looking for? It's looking for evidence of a prior exposure to the virus. So right now, since we don't have a vaccine, that would be an infection. When vaccine is readily available, you can one would have antibodies. Presumably, one would have antibodies also from the vaccine. They should be, hopefully, they're very hardy antibodies. So earlier in the pandemic, and again, it's hard for that not to feel like 10 years ago, but it was just months ago. We were and I think probably there was some hope involved that, hey, if we can do these antibody tests, we'll get on an individual level, we can get an understanding of that person, if perhaps those antibodies, that is showing immunity to the virus. So if that test was, say, positive, there are antibodies there, that would mean that person was immune from a subsequent infection. What we're finding is we don't know what it means, and we're getting signals that if there is immunity, so let's say that someone had an infection and they recover and maybe they have antibodies, we don't think that the immunity, if it exists, lasts as long as that we want, and some people may not have ever experienced it. So we're getting some more evidence of people who were known to be infected who are now getting known to be reinfected, and so that makes so if you remember, or if it jogs any memories, there talks about things like immunity passports. Before there's a vaccine, so that was the idea of like using an antibody test, like, oh, see, I am safe because I have these antibodies. Unless, while we're waiting for a vaccine, that just may not be the case. So that's just another example of that. So we've got these tools which include testing for infection and testing for antibodies, but then how we use the results of that are going to continue to evolve as we understand more.
So thank you. So given this particular virus, SARS-CoV-2, we don't yet know what herd immunity means. Is that correct? Okay, and could you walk us through, and maybe it might be helpful to compare and contrast herd immunity, what we might have expected with this virus, or what we're thinking about, versus herd immunity for influenza. Does herd immunity work for influenza? Just could you spend a little time with us on herd immunity? Sure. And how we should think about that going forward?
Sure. So something that's it's useful to remember is that viruses need to hitch a ride. They can't just hang out on their own. They need to be somewhere, and they need cells to do anything. They need to latch onto a cell and then use a cell to replicate and to do anything that a virus would want to do if viruses have wants and desires. Probably not. So the concept behind herd immunity is it making it more difficult, or making it more challenging for a virus to be able to transmit to someone else. So if I am an infected person, and 4 out of the 5 people that I could transmit to all have immunity to the virus that I'm infected with, that virus only has the chances of the virus being able to infect someone else and then make another transmissible vector, I guess, decreases dramatically. So the herd immunity there, so in different pathogens have different require a different percentage of herd immunity of immune people in a population to achieve herd immunity, depending on how transmissible the virus is. So if a virus is highly transmissible, like measles, you need a very high percentage of that population of, like, say, those, like if we had 100 people, you need a very, very high percentage of those 100 people to be immune via vaccine or prior exposure in order for that virus to have nowhere to go. other viruses that are maybe are less transmissible, maybe that percentage doesn't have to be, you know, everybody. So we don't know exactly what the percentages would be for SARS-CoV-2. For influenza, what's tricky about influenza is that for lots of reasons, I always like to frame them as kind of sloppy replicators. Influenza viruses are constantly changing. They mutate at a very rapid pace. And so the immunity that we might, so if I'm vaccinated for a particular influenza strain, or I have a natural infection for that influenza strain, and let's say that there's immunity conferred for that, because the viruses are changing, I would probably be less likely to be exposed to that same virus again. It would have changed in a way that would make me vulnerable again. So, and also because our influenza vaccines are imperfect, perhaps the immunity that is provided by them may not last as long as we would like them to, which is another reason why we make a lot of investments in improving influenza vaccines.
Thank you for that, Dr. Schafer. Let's pivot a little bit away from the assumptions and kind of look at our evaluation of the current response. And back in February, you made the point, and we discussed the importance of a foundation of partnerships being critical to the nations and the world's response, a foundation of partnerships that extend at the global level, such as the World Health Organization, pivoting down then through national level governments, down to state and local municipalities, communities, individual citizens, the role of the private sector. And so as you look across this foundation of partnerships in this current crisis, are there particular efforts that you would highlight where we have been successful in terms of our response?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's helpful to think about it at many different levels. I think that the United States is not a part of this initiative, but I think that what will be interesting to watch for the success of is the kovacs initiative, which is led by Gavi, which is kind of a organization that promotes and makes available vaccines around the world for equitable, so shared risk and shared access to vaccines. So that's the idea. So kind of going up against, often in a pandemic, we think almost like an arms race for where countries can be pitted against each other because there's only a certain amount of vaccine available, and then countries are kind of fighting to get access to it. So kovacs is this idea, okay, we're going to, these countries, some of which are very wealthy, some of which are not, are going to agree to kind of hitch their wagons together. The US, through Operation Warp Speed, has chosen to concentrate on making sure that there's access. So putting in supporting 7 different vaccine approaches to speed the availability of those vaccines, and the idea of supporting it would be able to gain access to those vaccines. So there are 2 different approaches, time will tell which will be I hate to say best. There are 2 different approaches. I'm sure we're going to learn a lot from both of them. And I think because the planning assumptions for pandemic planning assumptions had been for a very strong national kind of a coordinated response, and that has not occurred for a number of reasons. And so what has been interesting to see is where states and governors of states have coordinated amongst themselves and to address some of the challenges of the response, and we may see more of that as vaccine becomes available and they're thinking about distribution. So I think absent that federal down response, where we see more on a state level of coordination amongst governors.
Dr. Schafer, if could you spend a little bit of time on clinical care and the changing medical situation? And you can look at it even questioning perhaps some of the assumptions we might have had early on, but where we're also seeing in terms of a response, a quick adaptation or an adaptation to a quickly changing medical situation. How has the response planned out, both in terms of what we might have anticipated, in terms of the assumptions, and how we have responded?
Sure, and I will do my disclaimer that I'm a doctor, but not that kind. So I will be clear that I'm not providing any sort of medical advice. But you know, I think that it is a clear example of what you can see as we learn more about how to respond, how to understand what are the things that work. Early on, you can really feel for clinicians because there isn't a magic wand. They're trying to gather, you know, information almost like in the dark. Imagine blindfolded and kind of feeling around a dark room, trying to say, okay, trying to adapt. And so a couple of things that are really important around that is sharing, is clinicians sharing information and researchers sharing information. And this is another example of why it's so critical, where open science is so critical. And we can see the increased prominence of things like preprint servers, where papers that aren't peer reviewed will go up on a preprint server, clearly marked, hey, this is not peer reviewed. Like this is happening in real time, but getting information out while it's going through a peer review process. So we're getting information out so that clinicians have information that they can adapt to their situation and provide the better and better care. And so it's like so more data are going into the system, and we see that. And we can see the effect of that in decreasing mortality and because they understand which tools to use and when, and of course that's going to continue to improve.
Julia, it might be helpful for members of our audience to understand perhaps where other countries stand in the fight, or perhaps other particular measures that other countries have taken that we have not yet, or that particular areas of our country have not yet experienced. But, you know, as you look across the globe, and given your deep domain expertise in terms of pandemic planning and response, are there any countries, cities worldwide that perhaps stand out to you, either positively or negatively?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think we can all clearly look at New Zealand and say, oh, wow, like that's, and the way that they had a pretty strict lockdown, and then were able to reopen the country. And when they did have, and I think in Auckland, they had a reemergence, so they locked down again. But the rest of the country was able to, they were able to contain and stamp out. Now, of course, they're islands, so it's a little bit, so it's not as directly comparable to the American experience, where there are a whole lot more of us. I think we can also look at their neighbors in Australia, where they have also chosen to have very strict lockdowns when there have been outbreaks. For example, you know, Melbourne is just now starting to lift measures from a very strict lockdown in which residents were allowed out 1 hour a day, while the rest of the country, which was not experienced these outbreaks, was kind of going about their lives. So there are factors that allow that. There has to be a lot of trust in institutions, which is something we talked about in the last time you and I were able to be together. And kind of a trust that they can kind of see the outcome that there was an agreed upon outcome that everyone was searching for. And I think those are the areas those are some elements that enable that kind of success. You know, Europe, different countries in Europe, I think Sweden is a country that a lot of folks look to. They didn't lock down like most countries in Europe did. They chose not to lock down. They kept most things open. They did limit the number of people so they kind of did so like a maximum of 50 people and then in places where there would be large gatherings and smaller, and lots of hand washing and things like that. They did experience a lot of losses in nursing homes. And so we see a lot of kind of uneven experiences. I think that there are, and we can look at some countries in Africa that had more recent experiences with Ebola, and you know, something that that I think you and I have talked about, you know, offline is a mindset that folks had a mindset of responding, you know, of kind of like a pandemic, you know, or an epidemic mindset that enabled them to kind of everyone agreed, have again that common goal of, we don't want this virus here, so we're gonna take these measures seriously.
No, I appreciate that. And you know, you and I spoke that some of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and particularly West Africa, because of their experience with Ebola, provided a baseline understanding and infrastructure and experience that they were able to carry forward to address this current crisis. Let's turn a little bit towards the future, perhaps, and, you know, pathways forward for a post-COVID normal. I know so many times I focus on, when will this crisis end? But let's take a different approach to it. Dr. Schafer, how does this crisis end? I mean, so, you know, back in February, you educated us on different, you know, interventions, the pharmaceutical interventions in terms of therapeutics, vaccines, and then the non-pharmaceutical interventions, the social mitigation, community mitigation interventions of what, quite frankly, when we discussed telework and schools closing down and the canceling of mass gatherings back in February, in many ways, it still seemed very abstract, but now it has engulfed all of our lives. So, you know, some of us might be pinning our hopes on a vaccine, but I know that you've educated us a bit on, you know, it's not necessarily that it will supplant what we're doing now, but it'll supplement the current community mitigation measures. So Dr. Schafer, you know, how does this end? What does success look like?
Right. Well, thank you for not asking me when. So I appreciate that. So yeah, I think what you laid out is exactly right. The vaccine is most likely not going to be, or vaccines plural, are not going to be a panacea. I mean, maybe they will, but perhaps best not to think of them that way. They will be a really critical tool in creating, and even an imperfect vaccine or imperfect vaccines will be a really critical tool in creating immunity in more individuals in a population. How long will that immunity last? Well, gosh, even if that immunity would last 6 months, we could really decrease the opportunity for transmission in communities, and just, you know, just stamp out the transmission in communities. If we have enough people, we have enough immune individuals, even if it's not as long as we would want it to be. And then we pair that with increasingly better or more options for treatment. So those who do become infected and become severely ill are able to be treated effectively. We also continue to do testing and expand our thinking about what testing looks like. I'm really heartened, but as we have more tests that maybe are not as sensitive, that means, you know, able to detect an infection to the degree that you'd want if you went to a doctor's office, but maybe they detect 90% of infections, so you could use them, but they're really cheap, and they can be used in lots of different settings. And so you can have more testing, and if you can capture, say, someone has a very high viral load and would be able to transmit a lot of virus to others, you could take that person out of a group of 30 people. Think of what you could do in terms of reducing transmission in a community. And then we will continue, another part will be to continue to have, you know, some forms of social distancing. Maybe it looks more like the Swedish model, where things are open, but not with as many people. So those are all, you know, some I believe that all of those have a place to get to the place where we want to be, where the virus is not transmitting in communities, and we're able to return to you know, a life that is closer to what we experienced before.
So I'm hearing vaccines combined with a host of other non-pharmaceutical interventions with an added layer of expanded testing. Is this what we're hearing?
That is my personal recipe. You heard it here first. And I think that is, and it certainly is my understanding from listening to other folks who work in this space is that it is a combination of that, and some may emphasize some elements more than others, but those are kind of the toolbox that we're working with.
Thank you. I have a few other questions, but quite frankly, I'd like to be able to open it up to audience participation. Of course, our audience participants always have, just like they did back in February, always have outstanding questions to be able to pose for you and for us to continue this dialogue. Professor Chesney, is this something we can turn over to you right now?
You bet you can. But first, let me say thank you so much. That was riveting, and boy, there's just so much to take on. I know that we have a large audience. They'll have a lot of questions. I've got one queued up already, but first let me say for everybody watching, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I think it's where you'll find it. Put in your questions. That'll come to me and to Dr. Inboden, and we will join in to the conversation on your behalf by posing your questions. And then I'll probably sneak in a few of my own, pretending that somebody else out there asked them. But this one's a real question. So let's start with talking about some of the cost of lockdowns as part of mitigation plans. Famously, the country is in many respects really become a bit torn over this issue, which is of course very unfortunate. And it comes with the territory of any lockdown that there are significant economic and other spillover costs beyond the economic. Dr. Schafer, can you just talk a little bit about whether and to what extent you think that the observation of the varied ways in which we've implemented lockdown in this country over the past many months suggests the need for just a different overall approach? And if so, institutionally, where would we go to try to entrench that approach? Or is it the sort of thing that needs to be left as is, even with all the costs and downsides?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is probably the most difficult and painful issue. There are significant costs. I mean, there are really human costs that we're all living through. And I know it's been said often before, and I think it's really true, is that we're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. So people are experiencing the effects of these lockdowns differently, and some of that, and they can be just economically devastating. What's so important for those, and we talked a little bit about this in February, is the trust of what it's for. And so if there's not a shared vision or an agreement of what's the end state that we're all trying for, we can imagine that lockdowns can be uneven. And if they're uneven, then they're not achieving the compliance of it, is uneven, and then they're not achieving what they're intended to do. And then it's kind of the worst of both worlds, right? Because you have all of the social and economic negative cascading effects, but without the positive reduction, stamping out of transmission. So I think that what we've really seen is that it is a bit of, for many places, it can be all or nothing. I mean, I think we talked a little bit about Sweden, and there are some factors there that make it, that are very different from the US experience. But in terms of a lockdown, if you choose lockdown, it kind of has to be all or nothing for the time period in which it's happening in order to do what it's supposed to do, and perhaps be, worth it and the other thing that I would say is, for a lot of these dismissal of students, cancellations, that were around pandemic planning, they were also, the understanding of it is that the vaccine was again around influenza, in which the vaccine would be available much sooner than starting earlier in development for the availability of a vaccine that we are experiencing now with SARS-CoV-2.
All right, Dr. Schafer, I will put the next question to you. Thank you very much. Extremely helpful. So our next question concerns the virus origins. And the questioner notes that we still don't seem to know exactly what its source was. You know, was it a wet market? And we know it's Wuhan, but was it a wet market? Was it perhaps some mishap in a virology lab there? So, you know, two parts to the question. One, are you confident with any particular theory of the likely origins? Then second, does it really matter that much? I mean, yeah, it may as a matter of intellectual interest, but as far as for managing, controlling the pandemic, how much does it really matter if we ever find out where exactly this thing came from?
Sure. Well, for me, it doesn't matter that much right now. I cannot think of something that it would help me to know that would make us able to respond better right this second. I think that of course, there's great interest in how viruses evolve and to understand. I mean, I think that it's very likely that a virus like this can naturally emerge. I mean, so did it come from a lab? I have no reason to think it did. I personally wasn't there, so I don't know. I don't have any evidence one way or another, but there's no reason that it couldn't naturally emerge, if that's helpful. And as I said, I don't know that is the most important question to put our energy behind. I don't have a reason to think that's the most important question to put our energy behind right now, because I don't see, I'm happy for someone to give me a suggestion for this, but I don't see what knowing that would help us in terms of getting out of our circumstances right now.
Here's another question. With respect to wearing masks, as vaccines begin to come online and begin to disseminate through society, what's the right way to think about the point in time when the public health guidance will be that you don't need to wear them anymore? Will we ever not wear our masks again?
Well, I certainly hope we'll get to I would certainly hope that we get to a point that we don't need to wear masks. And I say this as a very dedicated mask wearer. You know, and I think that is going to be, I don't know exactly what the trigger will be in terms and how exactly decision makers will be able to, what points that they will use to assess. What I do hope is that those triggers will be communicated clearly to people so that there's a good understanding. I mean, I think we can think about and this is another, you know, I couldn't possibly say it enough how important testing is, because if we're doing a lot of testing and the evidence is that there's extremely low or no transmission of the virus in an area, there's probably not any particular reason to wear a mask to protect against that particular virus. Maybe, you know, if there's an increase in influenza, well, maybe we'll make mask wearing more vogue in prevention of influenza, seasonal influenza. But those are I mean, one could imagine that you're looking at evidence of transmission in the community to help give those signals of when it's safe to relax these measures that right now are so important.
Well, terrific, thanks. And as a dedicated mask wearer myself, I also hope we can eventually get to that point too. Although let's all of us remember that the more of us are diligent and conscientious about wearing masks now, hopefully the sooner it is, we'll be able to get to not needing them as much. I'm going to read the next question here, Julianne. I'm going to read it carefully because it references a particular scholar that you may or may not know. And I want to be sure to get this right. So the questioner says, I watched a video last night with Professor Sunetra Gupta of Oxford. If I understand correctly, Professor Gupta thinks we should protect the vulnerable and let the virus kind of tear through the rest of society to build the herd immunity. And she also believes that immunity levels are much higher than shown by the antibody test, because not everyone gets antibodies or they may wear off. And of course, you know, some other public figures such as Dr. Scott Atlas seem to have advocated somewhat similar approaches here. So the question is, what is your response to this proposal and thinking on herd immunity? And I know you touched on this a little bit earlier, but it'd be great to hear you elaborate.
Sure. What I would say to that is we are still there's so much that we don't understand about this virus's effect on the body. For example, if we just use one example, and I just read an article this morning about this, about athletes who had very mild or were asymptomatic. So they didn't even have, they were infected because they found out they were infected because they were tested, but they never had any symptoms. But that there's evidence of inflammation of their hearts that persisted. That is not, that is something that can happen with other viral infections. It seems to, and we're learning more. So this is another time where science is happening in real life. That this virus may damage heart cells, and we don't know how long it will take to repair those cells. And for some people, maybe there's significant damage to the heart that could persist. So based on that part of that, we don't understand all of the effects of this virus. We're still learning. It is difficult for me to advocate for more people to get infected when we don't know what the effect of that, what risk we're giving that person, even if they have mild illness or have no symptoms at all. If there's a possibility that that virus is damaging their bodies and damaging their hearts, then then we go back, and this is something that we talked about in February, is the precautionary principle. If you aren't sure, you're going to be more conservative. You're going to take fewer risks if you don't know the whole story. So that's how I look at that. I don't know this particular person at Oxford, but I'm familiar with the argument, and that's my thinking is that this invokes the precautionary principle. If you're not sure, you don't take chances.
So I'll take the next question, one of my own, but first I want to respond to Will's point about how he's a steady mask wearer. So am I. The sartorial opportunities, they're pretty great. I gotta say, some of the chances to express myself are, that's a little awkward. I don't know how Peter Parker quite does this. One thing I've learned from this is that superheroes who wear masks, they must have a really hard time when they're really in the midst of combat. On a serious note, I wanted to ask about lessons learned regarding the organizational structure of the U.S. government with respect to pandemic response. We've certainly been getting an object lesson in the multifaceted aspect of what is needed, with everything from the Defense Production Act on one side to the role of the CDC, of course, but also commerce and the management of the economy. Is it time to consider something more innovative? Is there any leading proposal out there for something that will provide a little more coherence, at least to the executive branch's engagement? Obviously, there are different ways one could set up the internal White House National Security Council operation, but just if you could wave a magic wand over it, how would you make sure that we have the quickest and best coordination across the different levers, at least of the executive branch? We'll leave Congress out of it.
Sure. I think when the pandemic planning that I was involved with over 15 years or 14 years, something that was always really a focus of that was this idea that we knew that guidance needed to come from and be consistent from the executive branch, and the executive branch would need to be all working together. So for example, if we think about an area like dismissal of students from schools, that would be something where the Department of in this planning, the Department of Education and the Department of Health and Human Services would be, for example, issuing joint guidance of like, and Department of Labor, where OSHA is part of it. So it's because there are workers in schools, there are teachers, those kind of guidances and those kind of guidelines would be sent out to help and what that demonstrates to folks at state level, local level, and then individuals and families is, okay, everybody who you'd want to be thinking through these problems are thinking through these problems together. And there is coherence in that what Department of Education is saying is in line and consistent with and complementary to things that CDC are saying. So I think that a feature of pandemic planning that I think we're seeing in its relative absence, why it was a pretty good idea. And it wasn't my idea, so I can say it was a pretty good idea without bragging. So we can see how important that is, and in its relative absence, we can feel what is missing. And that's the same thing going for other parts of the government, and that are more closely related to economic issues, about, guidances to businesses, to giving them the best guidance about how to do tests. Should there be testing programs? What would those look like? How do we keep people healthy in the workplace and allow workplaces to be open? And what does open look like? We can see how important that would be, and what a great help it would be to individuals, families, businesses, other levels of government.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Schafer. And my next question in some ways builds on your very thoughtful response there to Bobby about ways our government is organized. So thinking, one thing I've appreciated about your remarks today is trying to strike a balance between what we do know, what the science really can tell us with confidence, and then what we don't know, and how we just try to handle or assess or balance the risk and those unknowns. So I guess a thought experiment here. If we can go back to February when you and Michele did your first installment on this, still the early stages of the pandemic. If knowing what we know now, if you could have known what we know now back in February about how this has played out in the United States and globally, is there, I'm sure there's any number of things you would change, but what's the one biggest thing you would change? Maybe whether it's a different policy decision or a different resource allocation. I'm trying to leave this pretty open, but one big thing you would change if you could have dictated back in February how we respond, knowing how it's played out now here to October 1st.
Right, and I know that there'll be many books written on what, dissecting what happened and what didn't happen. For me, and of course, you all have already picked up on a sense that if there's I have many soapboxes, but my biggest soapbox is testing, and the missteps in the United States on testing are kind of difficult, were difficult to recover from. I do wish that, that CDC didn't have the challenges that they had with the test, and so I'm sure they wish that too. and I wish that we had kind of hit the gas on testing early so that we could have understood what was happening. I mean, so much of it is that and this is true for a lot of outbreaks, is that you don't understand what's happening when you're in it. And then there's kind of a slow dawning of, oh, we're already, the virus is here and it's probably been here a while, and we didn't know. And so anything, if there were all of those areas where maybe where we had the ability to know and we made choices so we didn't, those are the ones that I think I regret the most.
Michele?
Yes, I'd like to build off of that question, because testing, as you said, that this expanded testing is so important. Could you educate us, Julie, on how many tests should we be doing a week? And also, does there need to be a particular percentage of positive tests that gives us a sense of how we are doing, either in terms of response or in terms of the prevalence of the virus? What can you tell us about testing in those veins?
Right. I mean, I think that there are different numbers that have been used. I think that the Rockefeller Institute released a national testing plan where they made recommendations for a very large number of tests to be done each day, each week, and the resources that would take are it's somewhat staggering. So I don't know if I know exactly what I would argue, and I'll just argue. I'm sitting here in my home alone, so I can argue all I want. What I would argue is it's the diversity of testing might matter a lot. So so it may not be the exact number of tests, but where the tests are, who's getting tested, in what area, and are the results of the test going someplace where they can be gathered and understood, so that we can get those, to your point about, you know, to get situational awareness. So if there are a lot of tests happening in a community, in different settings, and in around setting, and especially in settings where there might be higher risk to find infections, what's happening with that? What do those look like? So it's what I would say is it's more than just a number. It's aware, and it's what happens to the results of those tests that are probably the most meaningful.
Okay, great.
Let me ask a question about the various vaccines that are in stage 3 at this point. I know nothing about this. I know just enough to ask a question that'll show I don't know anything, but I gather that one of them, I think it's the Moderna vaccine, is in some sense a novel approach to vaccine development having to do with messenger RNA. Is this something that any of us should focus on? Is that just a detail that should be left to the scientist? Is it an interesting pathway beyond the current crisis and maybe opening up a whole new world of vaccine research?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people have been really excited about the potential of approaches such as the platform, I'll say, that Moderna uses for that, which is, you know, as you said, it's in a messenger RNA. So it's the idea that you're injecting genetic, like it's a genetic instructions to make the antigens. So rather than like a typical vaccine, a flu vaccine, which by the way, it's a great time of year to get a flu vaccine. You know, a flu vaccine is like when you're getting antigens, and then your body reacts to it. In the simplest terms, of a vaccine like Moderna's is kind of injecting the instructions for those antigens to be made in your body. So it's elegant, it's really interesting. It's a platform that could be used for a number of different pathogens, and the idea behind it is that it theoretically can be manufactured very quickly. So those are elements that are very interesting. There are a number of, there are some there are just hundreds of SARS-CoV-2 vaccines in development with all sorts of different approaches. A number of the ones that are further in development are based on platforms or using technology that we don't have, that are do not have licensed vaccine using that same technology, or it's early in we don't have tons of experience of it. So in many ways, Moderna's is a very interesting example, and one we're definitely watching and interested in. And there's a number of others that are also using newer technological approaches.
Thanks for that. And let me just say on behalf of Will and myself and all of our participants, Dr. Malvesti, Dr. Schafer, this was wonderful. Thank you. It was so informative. I'm afraid we might need to have another sequel event at some point down the road. But for the time being, all of you who attended, thank you. Both the Strauss and Clements Centers, love having you at our events. We've got more events coming up. Next Tuesday, the Clements Center is partnering with the Stimson Center and Stimson's 38 North program, and the Korean Defense Veterans Association, for a fantastic webinar called "It's Not Just Over There, the American Commitment to the Korean Peninsula." You can see UT affiliated faculty, including General Vince Brooks and Dr. Sheena Greidens. And then on Thursday next week, the Strauss Center is co-sponsoring with the Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies to host Stephen Dudley, Director of Insight Crime, to talk about his book on MS-13, the making of America's most notorious gang. So yes, our topical coverage is sort of intense and morbid, but it's important stuff, and we like it when you guys attend the events. So please do that. Have a good rest of your day. Wear your mask. Stay safe.
Great.